So in this video, I want to talk about how the Fed changes the money supply. And this is important because one, you'll hear about it in the news all the time. Two, we believe that it has a significant impact on the real economy. And three, that it's how our currency functions. So it's kind of just important to understand just from using dollars perspective. Okay, so this text is just from the last video. The question is, how does the Fed complete its dual mandate of keeping maximum employment and also stable prices? And so it does this through manipulating the money supply, and it has three ways of doing that. So through open market operations, which is just buying or selling securities in the open market like any other person can. And this is traditionally, they only do U.S. government debt, so that's what we're going to talk about. Then it also does it by controlling the reserve requirement and the discount rate. And we're going to talk about those too, but we're going to do open market operations first. All right, so with open market operations, let's say that the Fed decides to buy. So we'll do A up here, and the Fed says, they say we want to buy $1 billion. So I'll just write $1 billion of 10-year treasuries. Of 10-year treasuries. And treasuries are just a special name for U.S. government debt. Okay, so the Fed has an unlimited supply of dollars. They have, because they print the dollars. So they have as many dollars as they want. And then let's say, because the Fed only deals with banks, or in the open market, but in this case it'll make more sense if we're talking about a bank actually owning it, because someone does own this debt that the Fed is buying. So let's say Little Bank owns this debt. They have, I'll make a little piece of paper here, that they own, this is a treasury. So I'll just write treasure, or treasure. And let's say that it's worth $1 million. So this is 1 million, 1M. And the Fed says to Little Bank, they say, you know what, I'll go ahead and buy that $1 million worth of treasuries for you. And Little Bank says, okay, you know, you're going to pay me $1 million for it, and that's what it's worth, so I'll give it to you. So now the treasury, and you know what, I'll go ahead and do this. The treasury moves from Little Bank to the Fed, and I'm going to put this in the after. And what the Fed does is that it gives Little Bank some money. So rather than move that around, I'm just going to go ahead and erase some dollars over here and then draw some dollars over here. So how has the Fed has increased the money supply. And so let's go down a little bit, and let's say, so for A, we had buy treasuries. I keep on misspelling treasuries. Buy treasuries leads to an increase in the money supply, and I'm just going to write MS. And how did it do this? Well, before, the Fed was holding all these dollars over here. And the Fed doesn't deal with any person, it only deals with banks. So these dollars were really just sitting in a vault that no one could touch. And the bank had treasuries, which the bank was just holding on to. It wasn't going to lend those out to anyone or do anything with them. So after the Fed bought the treasuries from the bank, the Fed gave the bank dollars. So now the bank has more dollars than it did before, and those dollars are going to get lent out to someone. So that's an increase in the money supply. Now, the opposite of that is if the Fed decides that they want to sell treasuries. So let's say that the Fed wants to sell treasuries, then the Fed would have in the before, hold on one second, the Fed would have treasuries and dollars, which is what it really has. It always is holding on to treasuries and dollars. And the bank would have some dollars. So, you know what, I'm going to erase all of this really quickly and do this all in green so that you can kind of make the connection. So give me 1 second. Okay, so in this situation, the Fed they have dollars, tons of dollars, and then they also have treasuries. So this will be, you know what, I'm just going to write a big T on it. Okay, so now if they are selling treasuries, the bank has dollars, and it always does have dollars. And so the Fed says, you know what, I'm going to sell this treasury to you. And the bank says, okay, I'll buy it. Maybe the Fed's giving it a little bit of a discount on it. But whatever it is, the Fed is selling this treasury, and the bank says, okay. So what happens? The bank moves some of their dollars, so we'll erase those. It moves these dollars over to the Fed. So now the Fed has dollars, even more dollars than it did before. So I'll write 5 of these. And the treasury goes over to the bank. So this has led to a decrease in the money supply. A decrease in the money supply because the bank had dollars before and now it doesn't. And in the after it has treasuries. So it has treasuries and no dollars. And in the before it had dollars. So that's been a decrease in the money supply because now the bank has less dollars to loan out. So again, if you buy treasuries, I'm just going to write this below. So buy treasuries, if the Fed buys treasuries, that's an increase in the money supply. And if the Fed sells treasuries, that's a decrease. So that's the most confusing of these, and if you get that, you should be good. Okay, so now we're going to talk about controlling the reserve requirement. And the reserve requirement is how many dollars a bank must keep in reserves for each dollar of deposits it holds. So if the Fed says you have to have half, let's say that the reserve requirement, and RR I'm going to abbreviate for reserve requirement. So the reserve requirement is 50%. And then the Fed lowers the reserve requirement from 50% to 10%. Well, if the bank had 100 of my dollars, so the bank has, let's do this in this before and after again also. So the bank has, and I'll get rid of all of this because the Fed isn't doing anything here. So the bank before had 100 of my dollars, 100 of my dollars, of my money, and it had to keep 50% of that. So it had to keep and just hold it in its vault, had to keep $50. Now after, the bank still has my $100. It still has $100 of my money. But it only has to keep, it has to keep, Control Z, has to keep only $10. And this is the kicker. Because it only has to keep $10, it can now loan out the other $90. So from before and after, the bank can now loan out, can loan an extra, and this is a horrible A, sorry, can loan an extra $40. And we'll see in the next video how much of a difference that actually makes to the money supply. But you can still see that if the reserve requirement goes down, the money supply goes up. So the reserve requirement going down from 50 to 10 makes the money supply go up. And then vice versa, the reserve requirement going up makes the money supply, leads to the money supply going down. Okay, so the last one is the discount rate. And that's the rate that the Fed charges other banks on loans from the Fed. So it's literally the interest rate that the Fed charges on its loans. And so I'm not going to do a diagram for this, but I'm just going to talk about it a little bit. So C is if the discount rate goes up, so the discount rate goes up, then that means that it's more expensive for the banks to borrow. and they're going to pass that on to you, which means that it's going to be more expensive for you to borrow. So you're going to borrow less and the money supply will be smaller. So when the discount rate goes up, that means that the money supply goes down because it's more expensive to borrow money. And vice versa, if the discount rate goes down, the money supply will go up because it'll be cheaper to borrow money, so more people will borrow money. So that is all that I'm going to say on these three in this video. In the next video, I'll go back and I'll tie this into the aggregate supply and aggregate demand diagram, and I'll also talk a little bit more about the reserve requirement. And I will see you there.